Good afternoon and welcome to the Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnerships 2022 Risk Management Webinar Series. I'm Megan Baskerville with the Nature Conservancy and Chair of the ISAP Steering Committee. And we're glad you're with us today as we continue to bust some conservation myths over our 3-week series. For today's installment, we have a great lineup of speakers challenging the idea that conservation costs. We have Ryan Batts, Paul Dietmann, and Dallas Glazik. A little bit about ISAP before we begin. Since 2017, ISAP has been working to create a network that supports a systems approach to improve soil health and reduce nutrient loss. The 15-member organizations work collaboratively throughout the year to provide consistent technical assistance to Illinois farmers and advisors on soil health and conservation drainage practices. More of our resources can be found at ilsustainableag.org. But for now, I welcome ISAP's coordinator, Jean Brokish, to guide us to the rest of this afternoon's event. Jean.
Thanks, Megan, and welcome everybody. Just a few housekeeping tips before we start and can hear from our great panelists today. All of you should see a dashboard similar to the one shown on the slide. And if you don't see it, there might be an orange arrow up near the top corner of your GoToWebinar window. You can click that if it's pointing to the left to expand it. And within that, you'll see a question drop down that you can use to submit questions to questions from the audience for our panelists at any time. You can also tag your question for a specific presenter if that's the case. Everybody in the audience is on mute, so while you might have a microphone button, it's not functional for you, so you don't have to worry about that. And then there is a chat feature, but we really ask you to not submit your questions that way. Just reserve that for any technical issues you might have, and we'll try to troubleshoot those with you via the chat. Again, use that question button to submit any questions for our panelists. One other little housekeeping tip here is that there will be some CCA credits offered for this session, and that QR code will be shown at the end of the webinar. So we'll try to give you a prompt to have your phone ready with your CCA app to catch those. If we go to the next slide, I think Megan gave us the rundown of our roster today for presenters, and I'm honored to welcome Ryan as our first presenter. Ryan Batts is an academic professional in the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Economics and has been the coordinator of the FAST program, which is the Farm Analysis Solution Tools out of U of I and Farmdoc. He has been involved with putting together annual training sessions, developing tools, creating support materials, and he is also a farmer in Central Indiana. And Ryan's farm transitioned to a no-till system starting in the late 80s and has been incorporating various cover crops starting in the early 2000s. So it's my pleasure to welcome you, Ryan. We can advance to your next slide and we'll let you take it away.
Thank you. Well, I guess welcome this afternoon. I guess we can go to my next slide and we'll kind of go through a little bit of my farm background. The farm is in Central Indiana, primarily corn and soybean rotation. As she indicated, we did start slowly transitioning to no-till in the mid to late 80s, pretty substantially made the switch in the late 90s, early 2000. We had some highly erodible ground that kind of sped up the transition, and we experimented on some other farms. Originally, I was kind of a hard sell on this system, but after a while, you could just see it starting to improve the farm, and it really seemed to work. We did start incorporating cover crops in the early 2000s, primarily cereal rye and annual ryegrass being aerial seeded. You can go to my next slide. We've made some changes to the cover crops program over the years, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Some more about the farm background. We soil sample every 4 years, probably going to move to 2 eventually. We split apply our nitrogen with the planter and side dress. We apply sulfur and other micronutrients. We do work with some municipal biosolids, and over the last handful of years, we've started experimenting with some biologicals. We also are big proponents of the system tile drainage. Part of the program removes the excess water, increases oxygen in the soil, and hopefully helps with the soil biology, as well as just makes it easier to farm all of our farms, I guess. Next slide. So some of our goals we've had with cover crops and no-till over the years, we're hoping to see some long-term improvements, which we kind of have with no-till. We're hoping to see the big one for us is soil health improvements, you know, additional soil biology, improving organic matter levels and nutrient availability, as well as improved soil structure. That was a kind of one of the eye openers when we started no-tilling, and it's continued to improve with the addition of cover crops. We're hoping to hold on to our nutrients a little better, less erosion. Currently, we are cutting back a little bit on our chemical side, and maybe at some point, I know other people have talked about cutting back on fertilizer. Hopefully, we can get there as well. One of our other goals, maybe not really a goal, but something to keep in mind, was we kind of started experimenting with this before we face regulations, you know, whether that's erosion or some of the water quality issues going on across the country. I'd rather kind of figure some of this out than be told how I have to farm. Another big benefit and one of the goals that we had was to get by with less labor. That kind of really helped this year. We had a wet spring, and it took us a while to get things done. So in the spring, we have like one person planting corn and one person planting soybeans. It goes pretty fast. We don't have to worry about the tillage and all that other stuff. And then in the fall, just basically harvest, and depending on how we seed our cover crops, we may or may not be involved in that process. Next slide. So again, some of our experiences with no-till over the years, we've gotten by with far less equipment, 2 tractors and planters. We still have our tillage equipment, but we don't use it a whole lot, except for maybe some corn after corn here and there, and just, you know, after we tile, we try to level things up. We currently still hire our spraying done, but that may change in the next few years. Some of the costs I put together in here come from our University of Illinois machinery cost estimates. For example, we've eliminated, you know, our fall tillage and our spring tillage. So fall tillage, according to our estimates, is anywhere from $15 to $30 an acre, depending on the type of tillage you're doing. Spring tillage is $11 to $17 an acre. We do calculate a $2 an acre additional planting cost for no-till versus conventional tillage. And all these can vary quite a bit depending on your actual machinery costs. And then to seed our cover crops, you're looking at $10 to $27 an acre, depending on how you're applying it. It could actually be less than that, and I'll get to that here in a little while. And then a couple of our other key takeaways has been, for us, no-tilling beans is a really simple decision. Would never think of doing it any other way. No-till corn has gotten easier over the years, but early on, you know, it does take more management, and you know, whether that be adding row starter if you're not used to that, working a little harder at hybrid selections, looking at a little different characteristics, and then additional planter modifications that may be necessary along the way. Next slide. Okay. So obviously with no-till, we're hoping to see less erosion, and I think we're seeing a lot less. There is still some, and that's part of the reason we've incorporated the cover crops, to hopefully have less soil loss as well as nutrient runoff. And I'm sure you all know your best soil and your nutrients leave first, especially in no-till when you're applying a lot of your dry fertilizer on the surface. We like to have that cover crop that kind of hopefully hold that in place. We have seen improved soil structure, so firmer soils. You know, if it happens to be a little wet, you can maybe get out there and get things done if you have to. Less compaction and better water infiltration over the years. Again, cover crops kind of have improved that even further. Next slide. So here's just kind of our current equipment program or our current trips across the field. You can see in the fall, we're just putting on our fertilizer and either a burn down program or a cover crop. We're trying to do more with the cover crops than using chemicals in the fall. In the spring, for corn, we typically apply a sulfur fertilizer, whether that's ammonium sulfate or just a dry sulfur product. Terminate our cover crop and then plant. For soybeans, that probably is a little backwards. We plant and then terminate our cover crop, especially the larger it is, and I'll get to that a little later as well. In the summer, post-spray herbicides and typically some micronutrients. Side dress our corn with nitrogen, sulfur, and again, some micronutrient packages. And we try to stay away from using fungicides and insecticides, but if conditions warrant, we still we still use them, but again, try to cut back on that. Next. So here's kind of our current cover crop program. Again, it's changed quite a bit over the years. So for example, in 2019, we were in a pretty wet area of Indiana, had a tremendous amount of cover crop or prevent plant acres. This was a mix that we applied to our prevent plant acres, so oats, buckwheat, flaxseed, red clover, and balanza clover. And then the last couple of years, we've used a clover and barley mix. And over the years, we've used other mixes. We used to use ryegrass pretty heavily in the beginning. And then for soybeans, we've just pretty well stuck with the cereal rye. It seems to work, and we really like the program. Next slide. So I've kind of covered some of the big changes we've seen with no-till, but with cover crops, again, we've seen a little bit less erosion, and we kind of wanted to continue to improve our soil. I feel like with no-till, you're maybe protecting your soil, but maybe not really improving it. And hopefully with the addition of cover crops, we can see some additional improvements. So as I said, we started flying cereal rye and ryegrass on different fields early 2000 somewhere. Before harvest, we've kind of backed away for that for various reasons. We've moved to drilling or incorporating after harvest if possible. Sometimes we spread it with fertilizer if we get a late wet fall, which last fall was an example of that. By the time we got done with harvest, we started getting a bunch of rain and ended up applying all of our covers with fertilizer or just spreading them. We try to use mixes ahead of corn. Not a big fan of just a straight grass because of nitrogen issues, that C to N ratio. We pretty well stick with the cereal rye again ahead of soybeans. Kind of replaces a fall burn down program. It's a pretty easy program to start with, and it's easier to financially justify, looking at maybe $20, $25 for a burn down or a cover crop either way. I'd rather use the cover crop, use less chemistry, try to control some of those winter annuals and cut back on some weed pressure. And we have seen a little less weed pressure over the years where we're trying to use the cover crops year in and year out. And we kind of look at the cover crop mix ahead of corn a little bit similarly. It does cost more depending on your mix and your application method, so it's not as simple as just moving dollars around. It may have a little additional cost, but again, we're looking for long-term benefits here. Next slide. The cover crops for us were maybe a little easier to implement than they might be for others, as we were already no-tilling everything. I do feel like maybe if covers would have been a thing when we started no-tilling, it may have helped speed up the transition to no-till, and that may be something to look at if you're still conventional tillage and things. As I said, we plant our beans green, so we're planting into standing cereal rye. Depending on when it's been seeded, can range anywhere from 12 inches to over 6 feet tall. If you kill it before planting, if it's really large, you can have some serious issues, so I wouldn't recommend that. We've had some limited issues, not really anything that's ever affected us, but keep in mind if you've got some large cereal rye and you run into replant decisions, it may be hard to make those because you won't be able to do stand counts as well throughout the field. And we've had some issues with the really tall cereal rye remaining until harvest and causing issues late at night when the dews start coming up. It'll start pushing up with the grain head. And in dry years especially, we've had some issues with voles. I don't think it's ever been a real yield impact, but just something that kind of pops up. And again, we're seeing a little less erosion over the years. Next slide. We got a few pictures here. Won't spend a lot of time on them, but on the left, these are taken not across the road, but pretty close to each other. A field of corn stalks with no cover, and then one of our cereal rye fields on the right. Just an example of kind of the weed control that we're getting early in the spring. That hasn't been planted yet. Next slide. And then here's a picture of some corn. Again, on the left, no cover and some poor drainage. Again, we really like our drainage. Makes our farms a lot more uniform and easier to manage, and I think really helps with the soil biology and things. And then we've got a field on the right with a cover crop. I don't remember the mix, but or even what year these were taken, and then excellent drainage. Next slide. Here's what our cereal rye soybeans look like after they've been planted in cereal rye. The picture on the left, I think, was some smaller, obviously smaller cereal rye, and a little while after planting. The picture on the right, you can barely see the beans, but they're starting to come through there. That was, I'm going to say that was probably some waist higher above cereal rye that we had a few years ago. Just kind of an example if you're not familiar with how this looks. And you can see for the field on the right, if I had to make some replant decisions, that might be a difficult thing to do. Just something to keep in mind. Next slide. Here's one of our mixes, a cover crop mix, a head of corn following soybeans. We drilled this. I don't remember what all's in the mix. I'd have to go back. I couldn't even tell you what year this was taken, but just kind of an example of an early fall establishment of our cover crop mix. Next slide. So a little bit of kind of our results and the things we've seen over the years and some changes that I want to talk about next. Over the years, our yields we've maintained some pretty good yields for our area of the state. Our county yields or our corn yields are quite a bit above the county yields. Same thing for soybeans. I can't say that this is, entirely related to cover crops, but it's a combination of our soils, drainage, fertility management, and our conservation practices. I do definitely believe they've really helped over the years. As far as our cover crop versus non-cover crop fields, the things that I've seen, nothing extremely concrete, but some of that's hard to track because we haven't been very consistent in the early years, putting the same farms in covers year in and year out, and I think that's a key. I did kind of go through some soil tests, and our organic matter is increasing a little bit over time. We haven't done any partial field trials to really see, if covers on one side of the field make a difference or anything like that. And there are differences, obviously, in farms, drainage, soils, and fertility. We definitely haven't seen any yield drags. So, no reason to walk away from the program. And we have seen some significant improvement, and especially on our poorer farms. The better farms, maybe you don't see quite the improvement quite as fast. Next slide. As I said, in 2019, we were extremely wet. We had a fair amount of prevent plant in our area. So we planted a cover crop mix on all of our acres. And everything that we took prevent plant on was soybean stubble going into corn. We felt that this was a better program than our neighbors that were doing tillage all summer or spraying fields over and over. That just didn't look like a good program. We had tremendous amounts of growth. I mean, that stuff got chest high. A lot, and you can see on the picture on the right, we tiled some farms that summer. The insects and wildlife were incredible. I mean, just walking through the fields, because it was late summer, early fall when we actually got around to tiling. And then the following 2 years on those farms that we cover cropped, we had extremely good yields. So I think the fact that we had that long-term growth, I think really provided some good benefit to us. Next slide. Here's one of the farms that we did prevent plant in 2019. We did tile it, but this is kind of what it looked like the next spring. Then the corn as it's coming up late spring, early summer. Won't spend a lot of time on this. So next slide just shows in the summer that we were side dressing, you know, how uniform and how good that corn looks. Next slide. The next few slides are going to cover kind of our evolution and some of the decisions we've made and how we do our cover crops over the years. So we kind of stopped flying on cereal rye. We had some concerns about roots getting into the tile, was one of the issues. We've never had any issues until this spring. We may have had our first root plug on a tile. We really don't know. When we dug it up, there wasn't anything in the tile and it started flowing. From what I understand from Purdue and other places, a lot of these issues are due to installation issues. We also ended up with covers in neighbors' fields and sometimes some pretty poor stands, you know, the spread pattern from a plane. And we also had issues where we'd maybe get early germination in the fall, and then when we come back in for harvest, the residue smother out the cover crop. So we just kind of moved away from that. It's also an expensive application cost. It did provide us a good way to experiment early on in our learning curve here. You know, we didn't have to tie up any labor or equipment or anything in the fall. The aerial application was the years that we had the extremely tall cereal rye, especially the later planting got. You know, if we got into May or even later planting, that rye could get extremely big. Again, we kind of cover the labor and equipment needs. Next slide. So we've also cut our ryegrass use over the years. We found it was hard to control volunteer ryegrass. Let's say if, you know, especially aerial application, it doesn't all germinate when you want it to. So we had some that would germinate in the summer and things. We tried it before corn and soybeans in the past. I think it's a good cover, and we have used it in some of our mixes since then. And I wouldn't have a problem direct seeding it, but I kind of moved away from the aerial again. I think I kind of covered this a little bit, but we don't like straight grass ahead of corn. If you do, I'd prefer to kill it early. It kind of ties up your nitrogen. You'll have to do a little bit different nitrogen management program. We kind of work towards the mixes, especially with maybe a clover or something in there, you know, not just a grass, but at least some kind of mixture. It kind of helps also stimulate some additional biology by simulating a crop rotation. Again, we are a big fan of the cereal rye ahead of the soybeans. Seems like a no-brainer. As I said, we're trying to now focus on putting covers on the same farms each year so we can see that longer-term improvement. I feel like it's kind of like no-till. You know, if you do tillage, if you no-till a farm for 10 years and go back in and do conventional tillage one year, you're essentially starting over. Kind of feel like the covers maybe are a little bit similar to that. We need to focus on keeping them on the same farms. At some point, I wouldn't mind adding wheat if the revenues justify it, so we can get that longer cover crop growth during the summer, kind of like we did with the 2019 prevent plant. As I indicated, our applications varied a lot over the years, depending on weather and harvest timing and things. We moved from aerial to drilling. Again, we spread with fertilizer sometimes. Sometimes we spread it with fertilizer and incorporate if it's just late and not wet. We really do prefer incorporation, especially into bean stubble. We don't get a good surface, or we don't get good germination for surface applied in bean stubble. Cereal rye, on the other hand, we've spread that directly into corn stalks several years and never really had a problem. Some years it may not come up till spring, but at least it eventually shows up. Next slide. So kind of some of our future plans for this soil biology journey we're on, I guess. do some additional testing. So use a thing called the microbiometer. I've got one, I haven't used it yet. I just bought it late last year. Some of the other soil tests to look at the soil biology and different things, maybe the bricks test. Again, we might move at least some of the farm to soil testing every couple of years to just track the changes a little more accurately over time, and do additional tissue testing. We've done some in the past. Haven't learned a whole lot, but maybe it's something we need to keep doing. Looking at maybe a roller crimper for cover crop termination. They'd be a little cheaper, use a little less chemicals, and maybe get a little better weed control by getting that mat on the surface instead of leaving the cover standing all summer until it breaks down. And then we might consider some interseeding, whether that's to produce nitrogen during season or just weed control or whatever other benefits. It might be something we'd like to experiment with anyway. Next slide. One thing I haven't covered is we have moved away from a lot of the traits, especially on corn, and we've kind of cut back on some of our chemicals. So we moved from smart stacks and triple stacks and stuff to just BT corn. I think we could move away from that. We don't use any insecticide, just our plain seed treatments. And again, we try to avoid fungicide and insecticide unless absolutely necessary. So we're cutting a lot of expense here that typical program might have. We're focused more on the micronutrients and biologicals. We have considered the move to non-GMO. We could capture some premiums and lower costs a little further, and that'd add a lot to the bottom line. Carbon markets, I don't know, something we kind of keep an eye on, but so far haven't been really interested in. Next slide. So I guess kind of to wrap things up, how do I measure my cover crop success? So the big thing, again, we're looking for isn't really, it's hard to put a dollar amount on, but soil improvements, increasing organic matter and CEC. So that means more nutrient holding capacity and water holding capacity. In a year like this where it's 90 some degrees and hadn't rained for a while, those things really matter. Less erosion, so obviously that's a good thing. Improve soil structure, make it easier for those roots to get down and access nutrients and water, and hopefully have less soil compaction without doing tillage. Again, we've lowered costs to some degree, hopefully continue to do that using less chemicals, and I believe that's a good thing for the soil if I can cut back on a chemical pass. Like I said, we're kind of reallocating money from our chemical program to our cover crop program. We've lowered our seed cost a little bit. Obviously, cutting back traits can add up to some pretty substantial savings. And hopefully, as our soil biology and organic matter improves, we can be more efficient with our crop inputs, including our fertilizer and other nutrients. And we're seeing a little less weed control issues where we are finally putting the covers on the same farms every year. And then I guess one of the other big things that goes along with the soil improvements is hopefully seeing more resilient crops. So, we've kind of seen that in years like this with the heat and drought stress that maybe they do handle it a little better. The shading maybe keeps the soil a little cooler and things like that. Looks like I'm running out of time. So next slide. So I guess to kind of start wrapping things up here, cover crops cost too much or conservation costs too much. No, I don't agree with that. Obviously, we're lowering some of our input costs compared to a conventional program. One thing I didn't touch on is, the overhead, with equipment costs and stuff these days, these large tractors for like fall tillage and stuff, just getting kind of out of hand. Revenues, we've seen higher yields, especially in stressful weather and on poorer farms. Eventually, the higher revenue from non-GMO. And like I said, it's hard to put a value on the soil health component. I do feel like you could probably see a faster return from this if you've got substantial weed pressure, if you're going to graze your covers, If you've got compaction issues, if you're transitioning to no-till or have severe erosion, I think your returns would be a lot quicker. And hopefully over the long term, we see some pretty significant improvements in returns to the program. Next. So I guess to wrap up, I've got some resources here. These are some of our resources here at the University of Illinois. The first one, some of our crop budgets, machinery costs. The second one, some of those FAST tools, they're Excel programs that we develop so we can do budgets, machinery costs. That we've got some other stuff coming that'll be available soon. And then our Farmdoc Daily. If you're not familiar, these are this is a daily blog where we just post on all kinds of different topics, but does include soil health and different things. And then our cover crop analyzer. And then my last slide, I think here, a couple other resources that I've used over the years to look for information on different cover crops. So I guess with that, I guess I'm done.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, and we'll be sharing and including links to some of these resources in the follow-up email that goes to participants. So thanks for that great detailed overview of how you're approaching this myth or busting this myth. And I'll go to the next slide and queue up our second presenter, Paul Dietmann. Paul is the Senior Focused Lending Specialist at Compeer Financial, a member-owned rural lending cooperative and farm credit system institution serving the upper Midwest, including about, I think, the top half or the top third of Illinois. Paul co-leads Compeer's Emerging Markets program, which provides loans and business planning assistance to farmers who market their products through local food systems. Paul's originally from Illinois, I think, and attended the University of Illinois, studying ag economics and then a master's degree from UW-Madison. He is a co-author of a couple books, one called Fearless Farm Finances, Farm Financial Management Demystified, which is very alliterative there, Paul. It's a lot of F's and M's in there. And then Financial Risk Management for Specialty Crop Farmers, and he's also the author of Turning Grain into Dough, Farm Financial Management for Organic Grain and Crop Rotation. So Paul's going to be talking with us a little bit about just how you evaluate and how do you account, look at your soil health balance sheet. So I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Okay, thanks, Jean. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and visiting with folks back in my home state of Illinois. So I'm going to talk about profit and cash flow and how that relates to conservation practices, and then also talk a bit from a lender's perspective, how we look at proposals from our clients who are thinking about adopting some of these practices. Next slide. So do we want profit, or do we want cash flow, or do we want both profit and cash flow? I think a lot of people use these terms profit and cash flow interchangeably, but they're actually very different things, and they tell you different things about your farm operation and have different implications when it comes to adopting some sorts of new practices. Next slide. So what is profit? Well, profit is really the return on the farmer's investment of time, labor, and money. And so when we talk about profit, we're really talking about a return on an investment. And that return can be in cash, but it also can be in other things as well. I purposely put time and labor before money because I think we always think about profit in terms of dollars and return on our investment of cash, but we don't think about it as a return on our investment of time and labor too. And just like we only have so much cash, we only have so much time and so much labor to put into anything. It's one of the things, as Ryan was talking, he mentioned the labor savings that have come from switching to no-till in particular. And that has become more and more critical, just as we've had more difficult times finding people to work on farms, or we have only so much time to put into our own farm operations. We want to get the best return on the investment of that time as we possibly can. And so we have to think in terms beyond just dollars and cents. When we measure profit, we're typically measuring it by rate of return on assets and rate of return on equity. So we're looking at the balance sheet and we're comparing the financial performance of the farm to the assets and the equity on a farm's balance sheet. When we calculate profit, we include some non-cash expenses. So we include things like depreciation. We're not sitting down right now to check for depreciation every year. it's a true cost on the farm. If you've got machinery, it's wearing out, it's rusting. If you've got buildings, they're wearing out, they're going to need improvements at somewhere along the line. And so we do have some non-cash expenses that get factored in when we're calculating profit. When we calculate profit, we also exclude principal payments on loans. We include the interest that's being paid on loans, but we don't include the principal payments that are being made on loans. And sometimes farmers will say, well, why is that? Why wouldn't we include that when we're calculating profit? Because we have to pay that. Yeah, we do have to pay that. But when you're borrowing money, it's just like borrowing a piece of equipment. You know, if you borrow a piece of equipment, you pay a rental fee on it, you give the equipment back when you're done using it. It's the same with borrowing money. You're renting the use of that money for a period of time. And the interest that you're paying is really the rental fee that you're paying for the use of those dollars. When you give the principal back, you're just returning what you had borrowed. It's not something that is a true cost to the farm. And so that's why we don't include that when we're calculating profit. Profit includes a number of items of value that are produced by the farm that aren't sold for cash. So you may incur expenses to put in a crop of corn in a year's time, and at the end of the year, you put it into storage. So it didn't turn into cash during the year. When we calculate the profitability of the farm operation, we're going to include the change in the inventory because you put that crop into inventory. You had expenses that were tied up, you produced something of value, you need to take credit for that thing of value that we produced. Next slide. So that was profit. What's cash flow? So how is cash flow different than profit? Well, cash flow is all the cash that comes into the farm operation, all the cash that goes out on either a monthly or an annual basis. When we calculate cash flow, we don't include non-cash expenses like depreciation because, again, we're not writing out a check for depreciation. We're not going to take into account the changes in accounts receivable or accounts payable, which we would if we were calculating profit. We won't include any changes in inventories of livestock or crops or anything like that because we're only looking at cash in and cash out. If something went into inventory, there was no cash that came in from putting it into inventory. Excuse me. When we calculate cash flow, we also include new loan proceeds. So if you take a loan during the year, any of the proceeds of that loan, the principal that you've borrowed on that loan, that's going to be cash that becomes available to the farm. So it's cash in during the year. Any principal and interest payments that you make, that's cash out. Here we are including principal because it's cash that left the farm. When we look at cash flow, we typically want to include non-farm income and family living expenses along with that because we want to know how much cash is available to the farm operation. Next slide. So some farms are profitable but have poor cash flow. Now, I think about this in terms of often it's someone who's just getting started farming. Maybe you're starting a beef cow herd. You've got a lot of cash going out. You're buying breeding stock, you're putting up fence, you've got feed expenses, you've got cash going out, but you have no cash coming in. However, when we calculate profitability, we're going to take into account that you've got calves at the end of the year that you didn't have at the beginning of the year, and they have value. And so you may be profitable even though your cash flow was poor for the whole year. Maybe all the cash flow was negative. It was all cash going out, there was no cash coming in. You could still have been profitable. We have a lot of farms that have good cash flow but are unprofitable. Remember, when we calculate profit, we're calculating rate of return on assets, rate of return on equity. You may have no debt, your kids are grown and they're out of the house, so your family living costs are relatively low. You've got good cash flow, but if you calculate rate of return on assets, rate of return on equity, the profitability is actually really pretty low. And that's why we see farm assets transferring at less than market value from one generation to the next, because the farm wasn't profitable, but nobody ever sat down and calculated it. The older generation was getting along just fine. They had plenty of cash to live on. The next generation can't come in, pay market value for those assets, and have that farm be a going concern. We need to be profitable and have positive cash flow to be sustainable over the long run. So we need to think about both profit and cash flow when making decisions that impact the farm's finances over the long term, and conservation practices being one of those things. Next slide. So we typically estimate profits using enterprise budgets. And Ryan alluded to enterprise budgets. Farmdoc, if you haven't looked at Farmdoc, it's a fantastic resource. They've got loads and loads of information there. I use it a lot. I'm going to go through an example of just a very simple enterprise budget to kind of give you a flavor of that. Next slide. So this is what a corn enterprise budget for 2022 might look like in Illinois. We've got the top line revenue that we're expecting, 220 bushels to the acre times $7 a bushel. That's $1,400 of revenue that we're expecting for the year on a per acre basis. Then we've got a bunch of variable costs. So those are costs that if you weren't producing a crop at all, you wouldn't have. They're costs that you typically are sitting down writing out checks for during the growing season. So it's seed, fertilizer, chemicals, tillage, all those sorts of things, crop insurance, operating interest, and all that. I'm estimating the total variable cost for this enterprise about $625. And then we have some overhead expenses. So these are expenses you're going to have whether you're producing a crop or not. If you own land, you've got costs that are associated with that land, whether you grow a crop on it or not. I'm putting in a land charge of $300. That could be actual cost or it could be opportunity cost. You could rent your land out for $300. So you should charge your corn enterprise $300 an acre for the land as well. And then non-land overhead costs. So this would be the investment you have tied up in your machinery. This is return on your time and your labor, all those sorts of things. So non-land overhead costs of about $90. So $390 of overhead costs. We calculate a break-even two different ways. So we're going to calculate a break-even price to cover the variable costs. If we can't at least cover variable costs, we shouldn't even be growing this crop. We take the $625 of variable costs, we divide it by 220 bushels, our expected yield. That gives us $284 a bushel. So as long as we're getting at least $284 a bushel for corn, we should be in the corn business. You know, we're definitely going to cover our variable costs, especially a year like this. However, we want to cover all of our costs over the long term, right? We want to make sure that we're being adequately compensated for our investment of land, our investment of time, of labor, and our money. So we calculate a break-even price to cover all costs. All costs are $1,015 divided by 220 bushels. That's $461 a bushel. So this is going to be a pretty good year for a lot of farmers, even with high fuel costs and high fertilizer costs. So as long as you can get more than $461 a bushel, you're going to be making money this year. At least you're going to be making a profit, it looks like. Next slide. So are we really going to pocket $385 an acre for every acre of corn that we're growing if our enterprise budgets are correct? Maybe, and maybe not. You know, sometimes those overhead costs are actual cash costs. Sometimes they're not. You know, so if you're renting land and you're paying $300 an acre for rent, that's a true cash cost. You're writing out a check for $300 an acre. If you own the land and you just have property taxes, you don't have any debt on it, you might be paying $10, $15, $20 an acre is all. And so you'd be pocketing more than $385 an acre. And the same with the other overhead costs. Next slide. So that's kind of a rough back of the envelope estimate of profit potential. And again, profit potential and cash flow are two different things. From a cash flow standpoint, we're missing some stuff. And that's the impact of crop rotations on overall profitability of the farm. So I'm just looking at a corn enterprise budget. I didn't put up a soybean budget. I didn't put up a wheat budget, a hay budget. We're just looking at what corn might look like this year. We're also using an average for corn. You may have land that's highly productive. You may have land that's marginally productive. And you may need to have enterprise budgets for three different corn enterprise budgets rather than just one, because there's no such thing as a real average. We're not including principal payments on machinery or real estate loans here, so that profit potential that could be chewed up by loan payments. Family living costs we didn't include in there. So if your family living cost is high, that might really impact your cash flow. And then we didn't include any income tax liability as well. So it's an estimate of profit, not an estimate of cash flow. Next slide. So how do soil health practices affect profit potential? Next slide. So cover cropping, this is a really good publication that came out of the SARE program, Sustainable Ag Research and Education program, several years ago. In their study, corn yields increased the first year of cover cropping by about 0.52%. By the fifth year, they started seeing a bit more of an impact from that, and yields were up at 3%. Soybean yields increased 2.12 the first year and almost 5% by the fifth year. Cost of fertilizer and weed control steadily dropped over the course of 5 years as they studied the farms in this particular study. The median cost of seed planting and termination of cover crops was $37 an acre. And this publication is a few years old, so some of these costs are going to be a bit different, but relatively speaking, you get a sense of what the impact of cover cropping might be. Next slide. Gene Brokish's organization, American Farmland Trust, has been doing a series of soil health case studies. And these case studies are excellent. If you get a chance, take a look at them, read through them. There are 4 case studies in the Midwest, 2 from Illinois, 2 from Ohio. All 4 of those farms are on a corn soybean rotation, have been doing soil health practices for a number of years. The way that they looked at economics in these case studies is using partial budget analysis. So instead of going through like a full enterprise budget, they're looking at just the positive and negative impacts of particular changes in practices. And they're looking mainly at tillage and machinery costs, nutrient management costs, pesticide costs, and learning costs, which I appreciated the fact that they included something because there is a learning curve for some of these things, and then any yield changes. Next slide. And so this is what a partial budget analysis looks like. It's basically 4 quadrants. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at the positive impacts from making a change. So increases in net income or decreases in cost. And then on the right-hand side, any of the negative impacts from the change. So is there any decrease in net income or any increases in costs? And so when they put in all the positives and negatives, the annual change in total net income for this one particular farm was about $47,000. So the annual change in net per acre net income was $34. Next slide. There are a lot of other benefits of soil health practices that are a little bit harder to quantify, and Ryan talked a bit about some of this. The advantages of maybe taking poor quality land out of production, and Dallas is going to talk more about that with a particular case study here in a minute. The potential to graze cover crops. You know, here in Wisconsin, we still have a lot of dairy and livestock, and so there is potential to graze cover crops, which is a big benefit, not only just from the fact that you're utilizing that cover crop in a different way, but also you're spreading nutrients on the land. The ability to address soil compaction, making an easier transition from conventional tillage to reduced till or no till using cover crops, better water holding capacity, which I think has becoming a bigger and bigger concern, less damage to land from erosion, ability to deal with herbicide resistant weeds, fertilizer savings, and then increased habitat for beneficial species, all of which are difficult to put dollars and cents to. Next slide. So how do lenders look at adoption of conservation practices? I have a lot of clients who are using conservation practices, and I think sometimes farmers assume that maybe lenders are going to look a little bit skeptically at making a change in practices, especially if it's a change like adding cover crops that is going to add some operating expenses, some variable costs to the operation, and some of the benefits maybe several years down the road. Next slide. So when we look at a loan application, and anytime you hear a lender talk about how they look at credit, there's the 5 C's of credit, and that's character, capital, capacity, collateral, and conditions. Character is really where adoption of something like conservation practices, in my mind, comes into play for a lender. It's about what you've done to make yourself successful. What have you done to increase your odds of success? And I think someone who is looking at conservation practices and looking at it in the way that Ryan looks at it, the way that Dallas looks at it, which you'll hear more about here in a minute, to me, from a lender's perspective, that's impressive. It's someone who's doing their homework, who's really thinking pretty deeply about their operation, about what they can do to improve the bottom line. And that's a big positive when it comes to character. We put that with capital, which is your balance sheet, capacity, which is cash flow, collateral, which we have to support a loan application, then conditions, which are all the things that come along after the loan is approved. You put all those 5 together, that's where you make a loan decision. But to me, it's a big positive. Next slide. Beyond just the farm level, there's a strong push right now for ag lenders to support conservation practices. You know, a lot of the dollars that we loan to our farmers, they're coming from the bond market. And bond purchasers are creating and evaluating metrics for environmental, social, and governance, ESG. It's a term you're going to hear more and more as we go along here, but they're looking at that. They're saying, what are you doing when you're making loans to further environmental, social, or governance goals and making society better? There's a lot of federal support right now for climate smart agriculture initiatives. Carbon markets, Ryan mentioned. We've looked a lot at carbon markets at Compeer. We've got folks internally who are pretty positive about carbon markets. I'm a bit skeptical about them. That's a topic for several more webinars that we can't get into today. But they're there, and we're gonna keep hearing more about carbon markets. So there's going to be a strong push. Ag lenders have to start looking at things from a conservation perspective, even if they're not right now. Next slide. And that's what I've got, Jean.
All right, thank you, Paul. I appreciate and just was harkened back to college, Ag Econ 101 there, you know, so it was a really great overview of some economic considerations and tying it together in terms of where conservation fits. And I know we're going to have some question and answer panel discussion where we hope we can get a little deeper into that. So appreciate that information. I will transition now to our final presenter, who is Dallas Glazik. He's a Farm Bill biologist with Pheasants Forever. And Dallas grew up on a grain and cattle farm in East Central Illinois and received a degree in restoration ecology from U of I. He has been very passionate and worked a lot in precision agriculture and conservation, which allows him to incorporate profitable habitat on his own farm and many others across Illinois. He works with farmers to determine the layout, select a seed mix, and install and manage strips of prairie vegetation and other for erosion control on the farm. And Dallas is joining us today to really just discuss opportunities. How do we turn those non-profitable areas into profitable areas, or turning, you know, going from red to green? So thanks, Dallas, for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jean. One thing I definitely wanted to have on this, and Helen, you can go ahead and advance slides there. Kind of looking at I work a lot with the government programs. And so I wanted to give an example, and I was actually really happy that Paul mentioned Thorndike's farm increasing $34 an acre by using cover crops, because this example here is about 5 miles from that, so in Ford County, Illinois. And yeah, so you can see it's 160 acres here. He has a moraine running through, so it's a hard farm locations, as well as a lot of resource concerns. You can go ahead and advance. And so what he did, he came in the office looking for some help and found me, and we started looking at his data. And as you can see here is a 4-year average yield map combined of a corn and soybean operation. And this is what farmers are typically used to when they see any form of data, is just the different colors ranging from high to low of yield. Next slide. However, when you compare this to a budget similar to what Paul mentioned, in this I pull a lot of my information from Dr. Gary Schnitke out of University of Illinois. He does some really fine work. So if you don't have a breakdown budget, I would research him and see if you can't find some good examples. Go ahead and advance. But yeah, whenever you compare the two together, you're actually going to make something similar to this. So this is a profit loss map where all the red acres are losing money, costing money on an average of 4 years. Yellow acres are break even, and then green acres are profit. And so we decided to look at those areas that are losing money and came up with a site potential for some wetland programs because he had some tiling issues and was wanting to go with the wetland route. Next slide. And here's kind of the plan that we came up with. So we took a total of 27 acres out of this 160, and there's a mix of CRP programs. But what we found, he was actually, by not farming these areas that were costing him money, he was going to increase his profit on this 160 by $5,940 per year. And then with the CRP payment, he was going to also increase his profit by $5,119 per year. So that's a total profit change that he's putting directly into his pocket of $11,059 per year by taking these acres out, putting them into conservation instead. So this just really shows that conservation can pay, and it pays right away just in savings. And then whenever you contemplate the infield practices that he could do, such as that example just 5 miles away with Thorndike's, he could add cover crops and no-till to this operation and increase $34 an acre on his grain side. So he's left with 92, I think, acres tillable on this particular tract. So that's a lot of potential income that he can get and bring on there. And when you think about the long-term effects of this, in our area, tile takes an average of 3 to 5 years to break even. And so just by taking these acres out of production and not tiling them, he's going to be increasing the profit between $33,000 and $55,000. Next slide. And as well, looking at the conservation kind of benefits brought in here, he's going to be saving soil by reducing his T factor, and he's actually going to be saving 81 tons of soil each year off this farm from running off into that creek. He reduced his total input cost by 35%. And as well as we are looking at how much filtration is coming through this wetland complex of fertilizer protection, and all while building wildlife and insect populations that aid in the further reduction in increased outputs on this farm. Next slide. Here's some pictures of it. So this was recently done. This was right after the dirt work in year 2020. Next slide. That's kind of an idea of what berms look like. So this is on the farm. You can see it's nothing scary, nothing like that. Not building a Hoover Dam. It's very gradual. Next slide. This is a seed mix that we went based off that. Go ahead and advance. And then just some results in the summer of 2021, a lot of emergent vegetation came back up. This is the farm here with one of the wetlands in the center basin. Next slide. And then as well, this was that spring. So already he's been an active hunter and letting his grandkid come out and hunt and everything like that. So it's been a real enjoyment and bringing fun back to this farm. Next slide. And he was getting ready to retire. And one thing that Paul kind of hit up on was that it's very hard for young farmers to buy in to a modern operation. And that's one reason why I really want to bring this up, because he was actually passing that down to his, it was a 50-50 operation. They're passing it down to the next generation. So by increasing that $33,000 to $55,000 extra of profit on this farm, that allows for that next generation to have a better opportunity to buy in and make it more profitable for them to come into that operation. Go ahead and go next. But also I want to talk a bit about more the cherry on top and why conservation can actually pay more than just other inputs such as increasing fertilizer and tile and stuff like that. Next slide. So Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, he is out of South Dakota, and very, very good. Shows that in a standard cornfield found 107 insect species, and of which only 7% were possible pest insects, leaving 93% as beneficial or non-binary insects. So that's around 137 to 161,000 beneficial insects per acre. Next slide. And then birds benefit as well. By putting in these habitat areas along with your infield farm practices, you can actually decrease your pest insects, which again is only 7% of the population of insects. And one barn swallow eating 850 insects per day is not being picky if they're eating a pest or if they're eating a beneficial, but you can still receive a 33% reduction in your pest insects. Next slide. And so Paul also mentioned a lot about the ROI calculation, and I want to toss in a couple other examples here. Just kind of where you can see, instead of looking at the overall and how much profit they're bringing in, but breaking it down to a return on investment and how much per acre. This particular farmer in Ford County, he was farming 88.3 acres on this, and wasn't really looking at his budget. So when we finally looked at his budget, found out that he was actually losing $47 an acre on this particular farm, but it was washing in with a lot of his other operations. So he was good on cash flow, but not good on his return on investment. So we decided to look at that field and decided 32.6 acres were good for CRP, which paid at $234 per acre. And by removing that out and designing this field to be more accurate with his equipment, so that we became more time efficient, it allowed to decrease a lot of overlapping of inputs, etc. He actually turned it around to a $70 per acre profit, and it increases ROI. Next slide. And this is that in 2018, that farm. So he increased, those are all monarch butterflies, and increased the diversity, and is starting to see some yield increases on that particular farm just in his corn and soybean operation. Next slide. So that particular one, he was able to save 39.12 tons and reduce his input expenses by 46%, all in the process of building wildlife and beneficial insect populations. Next. Here's one that tags in a little bit more with what Ryan was talking about. This is a avid cover cropper. He's a big believer in putting cereal rye in front. However, he still had some areas of the farm he was losing money in. So we decided to look at this 83-acre farm in Champaign County and found out that there was just a little under 8 acres of CRP potential in that hard to farm corner that was also having some flooding issues. And by taking that out, would increase his profit from 387 to 404. And then what we decided to also do is look at his end rows. So instead of planting soybeans into his end rows whenever he has cereal rye, the plan would be to then let that cereal rye fully mature and continue to use his end rows as he would normally, turning on them during planting, during spraying, etc. But then coming through and harvesting that rye, and with a reduced yield input, he was actually able to grow enough rye to seed 240 acres of cereal rye at his standard cover crop rate. And that's by adding 9 acres of rye that he's harvesting off these end rows. And that greatly increased his return on investment, because now he was able to keep and clean his own seed and use that as his cover crop. So he went from $387 an acre profit to $449 an acre profit by utilizing those end rows in a conventional manner, or different manner. Next slide. Yeah, so I also want to talk about how wildlife and insects can increase ag outputs. So just a 10% reduction in field size, and this was from Iowa State University, found that you can increase a 5 to 30% yield increase on your soybeans. And then in Ohio, they also interseeded buckwheat into the soybeans. And this is one that I've been doing on my own farm. This will be the second year that I've been doing buckwheat and prairie strips along my soybean fields. And why I have not marked the 5% yield increase yet, I did improve test weight and actually saw an increase in food grade quality. So I was able to sell those soybeans at a higher premium versus the ones that did not receive the buckwheat and the prairie strips near the sides. It also opens up your avenue for alternative markets, such as introducing honey, introducing huntable opportunities on your farm, which can bring in some outside farm income. Last example here, going over some pollinator strips. This is right on the Ford-Champaign County line in Illinois. This farmer decided to go non-program because he was a big believer, and in 2019 installed 15-foot wide strips every 120 feet, so that way he was able to drive through the field with extended booms and still treat his farm however he saw, in doing so that he wasn't actually having to. But he was also grazing these strips with pasture pork and selling that into the Champaign and greater Chicago area, and was able to cut out all insecticides and herbicides with the use of cereal rye and these strips on his farm. And also Iowa State published that 10% he would actually reduce his soil loss by 95%, nitrates by 72%, phosphorus by 77%, and total N by 70%. And that's quite apparent in some pictures I have coming up. Here's a picture of them in that summer. So we went with a pretty light mix, but added some sunflowers for some nice good visual effects, and as well as bringing in some beneficial insects. And this is just kind of how they look like throughout this field. It's built with his system, so he was able to farm, skip the strip, and then farm the next one with RTK systems. It was real easy to plug, and so his equipment just reads it and takes that as similar to like a terrace. Next slide. And as I mentioned, how ISU found that there was a 95% reduction in soil loss. That was quite apparent in June of 2020 after a 6-inch rain. You can see all this kind of built up on this prairie strip here. He actually, from the conventional tilled neighbor, had an 8-inch soil increase along this entire strip, which was a quarter mile or half mile strip. So we like to joke and say he's the only farmer in Ford County that's actually gaining soil now, because at each one of these strips, he was actually able to stop a lot of that erosion. He had gullies forming, 2 of which through this field that now, as of 2022, he is not having to worry about anymore. And these are all unengineered strips. It's just planting native vegetation with the deep roots of the native plants, and as well as the tall biomass of the native plants. It's a perfect filter for a lot of your soil and other nutrients, and very easy to install. Next slide. Yeah, so for a wrap up, I want to talk about how standard farming practices can have poor ROI, and with the data and modern technology that is available out there today, it is quite easy to isolate those areas and able to take those. We can drop the lower yield areas. It's going to increase the profit, also increase the total profit of that farm, which in line benefits you in the long haul because it'll increase the APH of your farm for all insurance and allows you to weather out a lot more storms. By replacing your input costs with natural services, such as the farmer did with those prairie strips, able to cut out a huge expense of insecticides and herbicides as well, all by doing conservation. And perennial habitat has been proven to increase yield by bringing in sexual reproduction instead of asexual reproduction. You increase the quality and as well as total bushels. And then it's extremely simple and easy. That's why I have on there, if you build it, they will come. The soils and the wildlife was built for that type of ecosystem and environment. And so just by putting it back on the landscape, it is the easiest, simplest thing that a farmer could do with the best return. So by having a lot of these habitat areas as well as in-field conservation, it is a good way to improve the overall farm that's not going to cost you that much. And that's what I have.
Great. Thanks, Dallas. That was some great pictures at the end to illustrate the value of those. And just thank you for sharing that. And thank you to all of our presenters. I think we can maybe just advance. Yeah, so we're going to shift now to just use the last 15 or so minutes for question, answer, panel discussion. And I will invite all of our presenters to come back on. And I'll just kind of remind everybody, we're trying to bust the myth that conservation costs too much. So all of our presenters gave us a few things to think about to help counter that myth. And we're looking for some tough questions from the audience to see if we can dig a little deeper and further bust the myth that conservation costs too much. So I'm going to shift. I think the first question here is, kind of just asking all of you, what does it mean to be successful? You know, what is your yardstick for measuring success through all of this? So maybe particularly Ryan and Dallas first, starting with Ryan. As a farmer, how do you know you're being a successful farmer when you look around you and you see some other farmers, you know, not a lot of other farmers are doing what you're doing?
Well, I guess, you know, you can see erosion, you can see crop health driving by a farm, you know, cornfield that the height varies, the color varies throughout the field, stuff like that. Or I picked up a farm a couple of years ago, and right at the fence row, I mean, it dropped like 12 inches. It was erosion from, you know, years of heavy tillage and stuff. That fence, you know, kept my side there and the other side and washed away. You know, just stuff like that. I guess you can drive around and see. You know, you really don't know what they're spending, you know, their returns or any of that kind of thing. So that's hard to figure out. But.
Sure. How about you, Dallas? Any thoughts from your perspective as a farmer yourself and working with farmers?
Yeah, my level of success is being able to enjoy that land more often. So if you are farming and beating it to death and you're losing money on it, you're not going to be enjoying that farm. And so by analyzing the operation, taking some ground out of production, making it so you're financially profiting on that farm, and putting it into some wildlife habitats, you can get out there and bird watch or go pheasant hunting. Basically all the joys that, you know, Grandpa used to talk about as a kid, and still being able to send a family of 5 to college and everything. That's my level of success. If you can just enjoy the land again, you are going to be successful.
Oh, that's interesting. And how about you, Paul? If you're working with farmers, how do you know if there's a successful farmer?
Yeah, it's you know, typically a lender will say if they can pay their operating loan back every year, that's success. But it's there's a happiness factor to that too. You know, I was out to visit one of my farmers here a week or so ago who milks goats, and he just started grazing his goats. And he was so excited about what he's doing. I spent probably 2 hours there, and it just listening to him talk about it and showing off what he's doing and saying, you know, there were people that told me there was no way I'd be able to graze these animals. They'd never seen grass before, but he was making it work. You know, he's not making a huge amount of money. He's barely getting by, honestly, but he loves what he's doing. He's excited about it. He's got a plan for the future. That's success in my mind.
That's interesting. And I guess ultimately, though, you know, we have to have some sort of profitable, and I think, Paul, your slides really touched on, like, you need to have both profit and cash flow in order to be sustainable. So, you know, showing how these soil health systems can support that long-term sustainability, I think is helpful. And I guess maybe kind of a question around that is, what's a reasonable timeline to measure that? You know, because, and maybe Ryan, from your perspective, you know, when you first started, you said no-till was really hard sell, but eventually it caught on for you and you were a believer. What was that timeline and what was that process like for you?
Well, I don't know if I have a timeline, but it was just some experiences we went through along the way. You know, I guess to go back a little bit, we at that time we're using fall ammonia, doing, you know, a spring tillage pass on most of our corn acres, and then we had some of that highly erodible ground that we were no-tilling. We got into a wet fall and we tried to harvest some of that more conventional tilled ground, and we just couldn't do it. And we go to the no-till stuff, and it was just like driving off the road. I mean, it just the soil density, and we were growing far better crops than we ever had on those poor farms, and just seeing that, I guess. So it's not, I don't see a timeline. I just see, you know, experiment with it and see what the results are and go from there.
Anything from Dallas or Paul in terms of a timeline?
Yeah, I'd say Ryan kind of hit it good. What I've noticed, poor quality soils seem to have a more expedited timeline. You can see a lot of those results faster. There's less of a natural buffer per se within that higher quality soil. But those higher quality soils, I mean, that's still, they tend to do better in the long go. So like that Thorndike's example, they're really high quality soil, where the example I gave here, 5 miles just away, more on the moraine, he's able to see results right away, where Thorndike's going to see it a little bit longer. So the best thing I can say for a timeline is just keep your eyes and ears open, your senses. If you start noticing different changes, that means you're doing something good.
Yeah, and it seems like there's, from a cash flow perspective, usually the first couple of years, cash flow maybe takes a little bit of a dip. And that's where government programs can be really helpful. It's something Dallas talked a little bit about, but there's NRCS programs. There's here in Wisconsin, our county lands conservation departments have dollars for cost sharing to implement different practices, and that's where those sorts of programs can really kind of help get over that cash flow hurdle while you're waiting for the rest of the benefits to come.
Yeah, I want to circle back to that, kind of the value or the need for some of those government programs, but maybe just to kind of close the loop on this discussion, so it sounds to me like some of those, immediate changes in less erosion, those are all things that show up pretty early and you can see, and then there's kind of a longer view of other changes. Is that a fair summary of a farmer who's getting into this, and what can they expect to see quickly, and what do they just really need to be patient for? Anybody just having a thought on kind of just summarizing the discussion?
Well, I guess my go-to plan with the cereal rye, if you might see some weed control issue, benefits early on, or and you may see some slight soil health benefits, if you've got compaction or different things like that. So it just depends on your starting point, I guess. I don't really have a great answer to that.
Sure. No, fair enough. And I think it's a tough question too, right? And I mean, even tying in the whole thing about the water infiltration, you can't necessarily, well, I guess researchers in a controlled environment can measure that, but as a farmer, it's a very dynamic system and in your fields, and you can't always put your finger on a dollar value of that. But Ryan, you had mentioned more than once in your presentation, in a hot, dry year, your crops are looking better in this kind of environment. So yeah, and I think those are kind of longer term. So I think maybe just to recap or underscore this whole thing is it's a process and it's a journey, and you start and you have to kind of know what your why is and keep your eyes open for the benefits along the way. Shifting a little bit to, I guess, Paul, you mentioned, the value of cost share. And I think, a skeptic or question could be, well, why should farmers, why take on a farming practice that requires this government support? Can't these practices just be justified and profitable all on their own? Maybe, do you have thoughts about how you would counteract that argument or that myth, Paul?
Yeah, I was really interested in hearing what Ryan had to say, because Ryan, I never heard you mention using EQIP money to implement cover cropping, but it sounds like you've learned a lot and that it's working for you. You see the dollars and cents of it. Yeah, maybe, would you mind talking a little bit more about that?
We have used some of the different programs over the years, especially early on, our county, or I don't remember the exact programs, but, to get you to experiment with it, because it's like anything, if you haven't been doing it, maybe the dollars to, if it'll help a seed a cover crop or something, just to get you to try it, I think there's some benefit to that. And then if you see the longer term benefits after doing it for a couple of years, you won't need the programs anymore. We've used some of the other programs over the years to maybe make changes on how we do things, fertilizer applications or different, there's all kinds of programs. And one thing with being from Indiana, we've had some additional resources with our NRCS and stuff. They've pushed this stuff a little longer than some other areas of the country. I remember going to like cover crop meetings several years ago, 15 years ago or more. You didn't see a lot of that going on in Illinois, but so I think we have a little more experience with it over there, but I do think those cost share programs could be a good benefit, especially for us, it was easy. Like I said, we're coming from no-till, not as big of a change, but if you're a conventional till guy, there are going to be a lot of changes that you may have to make, especially if you want to incorporate this across the whole farm.
So is it fair, because I was kind of having this conversation with Megan before this webinar and just thinking and framing about the USDA programs, is it reasonable to think about these as, we value or society, culture, communities, we value these ecosystem services and we value clean water and healthy food and good habitat, et cetera. So rather than thinking about this as something, just one more thing farmers need to do, and here's a government, payment to help them do it. Is it reasonable, or what are your thoughts on kind of reframing it a little bit to think, like this is important, and therefore there's public investment in it, and there's corporations investing in this to try to get farmers to implement these practices and kind of help make that transition. What are your thoughts on kind of framing it that way?
I think
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
What I've seen, and I get a lot of, a lot of those resources and environmental services that we see, wildlife, water quality, soil, those are all taxpayer-owned assets that are available for all of us to utilize, all of us to benefit from. And so that's where I see the big push of the government programs, is to help protect those because they are ours. And yes, that is a private landowner that's there being the steward, putting it on there, and in charge of protecting that resource, but he's protecting it for all of us. And so that's where I see the government programs being the biggest benefit. It incentivizes and pushes those landowners to improve the assets that we all have.
Paul, you had something to add maybe?
No, I would agree with that. Yeah, I think it's a public benefit. And so it's reasonable that the public would put some dollars into it to help encourage greater adoption. The one challenge I see, and it's kind of a challenge that we have with carbon markets too, is that there isn't really a mechanism for rewarding someone who's been doing the right thing for a long period of time. It tends to be more of trying to fix something that someone was doing wrong, pay them to stop doing the wrong thing instead of paying them to encourage them to continue doing the right thing.
That's so true. And I think that's one of the things that we struggle with a lot too. And I know farmers struggle with that, but, and so how do we message that? And okay, so I think there's limited pots of money within USDA too, right? And so there's not enough money to accelerate adoption fast enough or far enough or wide enough, and so I think that's where it's important then to come back and really emphasize some of those inherent values, those economic values, those quality of life values too, that you all talked about, because your measures of success were all, not one of you mentioned net profit when I asked you what your measures of success were. So I think that's just interesting to think through that. However, we are here to talk about how do we, convince people that conservation doesn't cost too much. And I think, how do we sell conservation? We're like fast approaching the end of this webinar and this question and answer discussion. So how do we sell that stability and resilience? Because it's really hard to put a dollar amount on that. So maybe one way to think about it is I'll start with you, Ryan. Is there some thing that has allowed you to better handle those influxes of input prices, and what did that transition look like? Do you think your soil health adoption and your soil health practices have made you more resilient and has made you kind of more calm through high input prices, low commodity prices, et cetera?
I do think it's made our farm a little more resilient. I feel like our yield variability is not as extreme as it used to be. you know, whether that's heat or excess water or whatever. And as far as the costs and everything, especially in the environment we're in now, I don't know that it's helped with a lot of input cost, you know, variability or anything, but you know, I don't have to worry about the extra equipment and maintenance and fuel. I guess, yeah, fuel is a huge one if you're doing a lot of tillage. You know, $6 diesel fuel adds up pretty fast, not to mention wear parts and all that stuff. So, I mean, that's, I guess, I don't know if that's a good answer. But.
No, sure. Any other additions from you, Dallas, in terms of just seeing that resiliency and being able to buffer the wild West?
Yeah, one thing I've noticed, it is becoming easier and easier to track and see how conservation actually pays with the farm technology coming out there, the data collection, comparing that to a map and a budget sheet, and you can find exactly where your dollar's impact will be the strongest. And so I see it's very easy to show that conservation pays, and by removing your most risky acres, putting those into conservation, that allows you to buffer any storm. I mean, if you get a 6-inch rain and this one particular area floods out, well, if you don't farm it, if it's not profitable to farm it anymore, and you plant it into something else or switch crops and to one that's not going to be impacted by that flooding area, you're going to be money ahead. So by doing conservation, it is now easier than ever to show that it pays, and it all takes just a little bit of digging through the weeds and data.
And I think one point maybe to emphasize of what you just said there is kind of finding the right practice for the right space. I think that's one thing that we've talked a lot about, is that there's a lot of different soil health practices available, and not every practice is going to work for every farmer, but certainly we.
I've not found the silver bullet yet. It's definitely its diversity is the key.
Right. And just encouraging every farmer to look and see what could work for them and give that a try. So there are a lot of questions that we didn't get to from the audience, and some of them I hope will be answered by some of the resources that Ryan shared, and we'll follow up with some additional resources as well in a follow-up email. And I think if there are some other threads, we might pick Ryan, Paul, and Dallas's brains for some of those questions that have come in that we haven't had time to get to, and circle back with the audience to continue and encourage the audience to help us continue busting this myth that conservation costs too much. So with that, I will thank our presenters again. We have Ryan Batts with U of I Extension, Paul Dietmann with Compeer Financial, and Dallas Glazik with Pheasants Forever. Really enjoyed the conversation today, and I'll pitch it back to you, Megan, for some final wrap up. And just a quick heads up for CCAs out there, the QR code is coming next, so get out your phone and have your app ready.
Yeah, thank you, Jean, and thank you, Paul, Ryan, and Dallas. I really like the high-level discussions, and I hope we can continue this conversation on how we message soil health into the future. So yes, going on to the next slide here, we will get you out by 2:30, but this is for the certified crop advisors in the room that are wanting to take the CEU credits today. If you don't have the app to use this QR code, no worries. We'll also be sending the Google form after this webinar in the follow-up email, and you can submit your advisor number there to get the credits as well. And then also a reminder to all the participants that we do hope that you'll take a few minutes to complete our survey. A window will open up on your browser following the webinar when you exit out. And we share that information gathered through the survey with our ISAP funders and partners. And the hope is that it will help us understand how to build better programming into the future too. So finally, our final slide, we have one more myth to bust in this series. We hope to see you next week for our final webinar. It's happening next Monday, June 27th at 1 p.m. And the registration links will also be dropped in the chat and in the follow-up email. And always, please utilize ISAP's website for the resources. We have links to old webinars, ways to connect with folks doing these practices across the state, lots of things to dive into. So thanks again for joining us. Thank you to our speakers and Jean, and hope you guys all have a good afternoon.